hosted by the Public Member Committee. Our committee is composed mostly of public members, but also other people, CEOs and others who are interested in the kinds of issues and topics that concern public members. And any public members and others who are on this call, if you have an interest in joining our committee, please let Katie know. In addition to the quarterly networking calls, we have a monthly Zoom call of the committee. And most recently, we've been having a fascinating discussion of how public members might influence I.C.E.'s ongoing efforts to affect and react to and proactively affect the forces that are influencing the future of credentialing. As Katie mentioned, we also have a resource page on the I.C.E. web page on which you will this recording will be posted there, and previous networking calls are posted there, including a number of other things for and about public members. So please visit that page. And today's topic, of course, is maximizing the effectiveness of public members. And we have with us Catherine Dower, who's a longtime advocate in the realm of regulation and certification, and was recently the public member on the I.C.E. Board of Directors. And she is going to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Becky, and good morning and good afternoon, possibly good evening to everybody today. It's really a pleasure to be here. I am delighted to introduce this team. I think they're going to be talking about one of the most important and meaningful bits of research and reports that have been done recently in recent years on public members, on regulatory and credentialing boards. I'm so excited. I've read the report a couple of times. I've been engaged in the review of it, actually, full disclosure. And I also have shared it with a number of people and boards, and I think it's time to share it even more. And I look forward to hearing the presentation and then talking amongst all of us as to how to advance the recommendations that have been put forward. I want to take a minute to introduce the group that's going to be speaking today. First of all will be Diane Millett. Diane is the registrar of the newly amalgamated College of Health and Care Professionals of British Columbia, which is an amalgamation of 9 health professions in British Columbia. Diane has a keen interest in advancing regulatory performance, especially in the area of governance. Diane was involved in conceptualizing the study, as well as the data collection, analysis, and reporting. We'll also hear from Jocelyn Stanton, who brings more than 20 years of experience in public affairs, healthcare policy, strategic planning, stakeholder, and media relations. Jocelyn has worked on many high-profile public sector projects in BC, involving multiple stakeholders at the municipal, provincial, and federal levels. During her time with the BC provincial government, she was chief of staff to 3 BC ministers of health, where she provided strategic advice and stakeholder relations on healthcare transformation, including amendments to BC's Health Professions Act. Later, with the Vancouver Island Health Authority, she led the public relations strategy for primary care, public health, and mental health and substance abuse, collaborating with many community organizations across Vancouver Island. She's recently returned to public relations with Island Health in patient and public engagement. Jocelyn currently serves as a public member on the College of Complementary Health Professionals of BC. She previously served as a public member on the board of College of Naturopathic Physicians of BC and the board of the College of Traditional Chinese Medicine and Acupuncturists of BC before their amalgamation in June 2024. She also served on the board of the former College of Registered Nurses of BC before its amalgamation in 2018. Currently, she serves as chair of the registration committee for the BC Colleges of Nurses and Midwives. Jocelyn also serves as a board member and secretary with BC Healthy Communities, which is a nonprofit that supports municipalities across BC with local health and wellness initiatives. And we'll also be hearing from Bradley Chisholm, who is the founder and principal of the Regulators practice. Bradley has a background in law, public service, and governance. He is passionate about bringing good governance practices and support to regulatory boards. Through his consulting practice, he has learned about the challenges that public members face on regulatory boards and is committed to bringing solutions to maximize their contributions. So with that, let me hand the virtual mic over to Diane to bring on the rest of the team. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thanks to I.C.E., Becky, Catherine, and Katie for having us here today. Bradley, Jocelyn, and I are delighted to be here and sharing some of our findings from this work. I must say we are envious of I.C.E. and the public member network that you have. There is nothing like it in Canada, although it is one of our hopes and dreams that we actually have something similar that we can advance across the Canadian regulatory network as well. So we do follow your work and are very impressed with all the work that you've done to help support public members. So today we're going to be just sharing some of the results. Well, in a moment, I'll get into what we're going to talk about today and what the goals of the study were. But first, I'm going to pass it to Bradley, who's going to talk about why in the world did we take this on in the first place. So over to you, Bradley.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for the invite today. We were really from multiple different perspectives. I think one of the interesting things about this research project is we were all coming from very different perspectives. Diane as a CEO of a regulator, me as a consultant supporting regulators in a number of different ways, and Jocelyn as an actual public member, kind of sitting and experiencing these things. And from all of those vantage points, we were kind of seeing a couple of dynamics. The first is, and you can, if you review any governance review of professional regulators in Canada over the last 10 years, there is a pretty clear theme that we do not do enough to engage the public, and we're not incorporating the public voice in regulation as much as we should. So government has responded, regulators have responded. We have seen dramatic increase in the number of public members on our boards, new legislation mandating parity with 50% public members, 50% registrants. We're seeing regulators voluntarily incorporate more public members on their committees and their panels that are actually making the regulatory decisions. So we've seen a pretty dramatic shift and response. There's still lots we can do, but we're seeing more public members a part of the regulatory scheme in Canada. But then on the other side, when we talk to public members, we're still getting we were getting the same message that we don't know exactly what our role is. We don't know exactly if we're making a meaningful contribution. We don't know, what my role is with some of these really substantive topics that I'm meant to be a part of. That's not my experience. So just a lot of kind of confusion. And so combining those two things, I think, is a bit problematic. Increasing the number of public members, but not doing a better job of engaging those public members, supporting those public members to make a meaningful contribution. So that's kind of the challenge that we saw. And so, I think the three of us could have sat down together and come up with a strategy of how we can help. But I think it was Diane that really said, maybe we should confirm whether what we're seeing, what we're sensing is in fact, what exists. And so that's kind of why we decided to, before we jump to conclusions, do a little bit of research, see what public members were feeling, what some of their perspectives were, and that's really where this came from. So I'll throw it back to Diane.
Thanks, Bradley. So what are we going to talk about today? And we know that you will have access to the report, but we thought we would touch on what were the goals and what were the methods that we used to conduct this work. We'll talk about some of the key findings. We'll talk about what we heard from the expert reviewers, and Catherine referred to herself in this context, but Catherine was one of our expert reviewers, and we were very thankful for her feedback. We're also going to share just some of the nuggets that we have identified since doing this work from the various perspectives that Bradley just spoke to, and talk about some of our thoughts in terms of what could be next with this particular piece of work. Next slide, Bradley. So what were the goals of this study? We really wanted to understand who was in the mix in terms of public board members. So we were keenly interested in identifying attributes of the profile of those that sit around the various board tables as public members, and I'll speak to who we canvassed in a minute or two. We also wanted to understand what their perceptions were of how they could make the most valuable contribution to the boards that they are involved in. We wanted to explore learning and how we could be supporting learning across this broad group of public members, and what would be the most impact for them in terms of the learning opportunities that we might be able to provide. We really wanted to hear what the perceived barriers and enablers were to their participation on boards, which we actually learned some super interesting things around that. And ultimately, we wanted to provide some recommendations so that we can all think about how do we maximize the contribution of these very skilled, knowledgeable, contributing public members to the regulatory boards in British Columbia. So I'll touch on the methods, and I will say that none of us are researchers per se. I think I'm a wannabe researcher. If I could go back, that's probably what I would do. But we did our best to try and build some research methodology into this. So we used I'll call it a mixed methods informed approach. We started with a quantitative survey that was delivered by Pivotal Research, and actually I should mention that Pivotal Research is a research firm in Canada that does a lot of work in the regulatory space. One of their principals, Doha Melhem, was involved in supporting this work, and she just wasn't able to present today. But we certainly acknowledge the work that Doha and Pivotal Research contributed to this. So we had our 28-item survey, and that was followed by 3 focus groups, and we recruited those from for the focus groups from the survey. We asked if people were interested in participating in a focus group, and that's how we actually were able to attract people to that. We did some analysis of the findings. We also did a literature review, and the review really focused on the evolution of professions and the public board member role. As well, we tried to explore literature around the value add. But honestly, there is not a lot written on this, and you probably know that. There's some in medicine, but there really is a paucity of literature out there. So I think there's a great opportunity to contribute to the body of knowledge in this with respect to this topic. We also received expert feedback. So we had 7 experts from around the globe, and we'll talk about that in more detail. And we sampled 24 health and non-health boards. So Bradley, next slide. I'll just speak to who we canvassed and sort of what the broad profile looks like. So in British Columbia, there are 24 health and, at the time, 24 health and non-health regulatory boards. And we canvassed all of those under the Health Professions Act. So that's all the health regulators, under the Professional Governance Act, so that would be technical professions, agrologists, foresters, engineers, engineering techs, that sort of group, and the boards that govern the Law Society and the Colleges of Social Work and Veterinary Medicine. So we tried to extend our reach as broadly as we could. We identified that amongst those 24, there were a potential of 97 public board members, and the survey went out to 93 of them. So 4 indicated they weren't interested in participating or weren't able to at the time. And we were super pleased. We had a 51% response rate, and we had 18 participants in our 3 focus groups. So from the survey, the majority of respondents were from health regulators, and that's not surprising because the majority of these boards were health regulators with a larger number of public appointees. The predominantly women responded. And you'll hear more in a few minutes about the diversity of the group in terms of sort of age and profile. But other characteristics include that 95% of the board members had not-for-profit board experience, and 50% of them were members of regulated professions themselves, which we learned it was an interesting, it's an interesting discussion around whether that's an appropriate profile for these boards or not. There are definitely some strong opinions on one side or the other about whether regulated professions themselves should be members of these boards. In terms of our focus groups, we had varied backgrounds from a range of the regulators and a good mix in terms of gender. So we were quite pleased with the voices that we heard both through the survey and also through the focus groups. Most of them were very, very experienced though in board governance, not necessarily regulatory board governance, and we'll speak to that. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bradley, who's going to talk about some of the findings.
Yeah, great, thank you. I think one of the, just to, before I jump into the findings, you know, this is a pretty small research project. And I think we have to, you know, one of the cautions from the expert panel was, you know, let's take it with a grain of salt. You know, there was only, you know, 50-ish people that are tapped into here. One of the next steps that we will talk about is that we would love to see something like this, you know, done more broadly, you know, across the country or in partnership with other provinces to see if, you know, what some of these findings that we've seen are reflected in a broader study. So just to kind of keep that in mind. So a few of the findings. The first is really around kind of motivation and perception. And I think that what's really important here is that what we found was really aligned with the literature, that public members are really motivated by this core drive to serve the public. It is an act of public service to be a part of these boards. People aren't doing it to get rich. Some people are doing it to continue to, you know, build their networks and their governance experience, but at the very core of it, people were doing it to serve. And I think they were doing it to serve the public. We heard that a lot more than doing it to serve any profession, which was interesting. The second finding around this was we kind of went in with the assumption that because we had heard a few pieces of feedback from people that public members, we were going to see that public members didn't feel included, that they didn't feel that their voices were heard. And that was not the case. That we really did feel from this group of, especially in the focus groups, when we dug into this a little bit deeper, public members really felt heard. They felt that they didn't necessarily think that they were making as much of a meaningful contribution as they could, but when they did contribute, they didn't feel that they were being kind of pushed outside, you know, the professional circle. So that was just a really interesting finding in our environment. I suspect that would have been different if we would have done this 5-10 years ago. I think that there's been a lot of shift in BC. There was some feedback just around, you know, how best do we serve? Like, what is that meaningful contribution? And there was some people that really felt that just that general contributing, that general public voice was the major contributor. Some felt that they're bringing their own professional experience. You know, we talked about 50% of the people that responded were professionals, regulated professionals themselves. We got a sense that those people felt a little bit more confident and clear in terms of what they could contribute, because part of what they contributed was that professional perspective, whether it be an accounting background, a legal background, an HR background. There was that kind of confidence that they brought to the table. And then another finding was people just saying that my own personal lived experience, that perspective is really valuable at the table. And I want to be able to share, you know, part of that. There was a real variation in terms of how long it takes for people to feel confident at the table. And so there, you know, there's definitely an average that we came to, but we really felt some people felt more confident, people with more governance background, and we felt that people that had this from these professions often felt they could hit the ground running sooner than others. And so I think there's some more work to be done to really understand what can we do to make people feel confident sooner, because I do think we want public members to feel confident as soon as possible, because sometimes there was one of the phrases that kept coming up in the focus groups is that, the idea of stupid questions. I don't want to ask stupid questions. But I think many of us have probably experienced that sometimes it's those stupid questions that actually shift the conversation. And so how can we give public members the confidence to ask those stupid questions, or what they feel might be stupid questions, because that's actually, might force the room to think about something differently. So a couple of the key considerations, I think regulators need to really use this public service draw in order to recruit regulators. The regulators themselves, I think for a long time, really used the professional draw. Come and support nurses, come and support doctors. And what we've found is these people aren't here to serve the professions, they're here to serve the public. And so really using that as a draw. And then exploring further, what do we need to do to help people feel up to speed, have that confidence sooner. A couple of the things, we asked a few questions about what do you feel are the most important qualities in the regulatory boardroom. And this was very interesting because there's a combination of learning and understanding. So people said understanding of regulatory governance, understanding of the actual practice environment of the profession that's being regulated. But then you also understanding of professional regulation generally, how it works. But then there was also a few things that were more practice-based, where and this will be a theme that we'll talk about again in the learning section, but the ability to ask, good, critical, strategic questions. The ability to navigate conflict and navigate difficult conversations. And then almost more of a personality trait of being open and curious. So kind of a combination of what people sensed was valuable was not just knowledge and experience, but also these practices. And there are some, I think, personality attributes here too. So that was just kind of a curious finding with one of the questions. One of the quotes from the focus groups, there's literally no education you can buy for learning about professional regulation combined with governance and the public interest. It is a very unique role. And I think that's very true. And I think there's huge opportunities to help provide some of this type of education. Role and mandate was another kind of big theme of findings. And the biggest finding here is that there is no clear articulation of what the role of a public member actually is. And that starts with the legislation. There's no legislation in the country that clearly articulates what the role is. And I think for some of us, we recognized some of us governance geeks kind of recognized that this was an issue, but what came out here is this is actually a barrier on the front lines as public members, try to figure out how to make a meaningful contribution. One of the issues is I don't actually know what my role really is. Am I here to bring my lived experience? Am I here to bring my professional experience? Am I here to represent the interests of the people that appointed me, i.e. government? So lots of, I think, really important questions that somehow need to be answered. And then in addition to that, there was just a real lack of lots of learning opportunities, but a piece of feedback around lack of good orientation. So, and non-consistent orientation, and I think this ties back to the other finding of helping people get up to speed quickly. So a few key considerations here. Again, what does robust orientation look like? How can we do a better job of that? How can we work with government or just work together as a collection of regulators to help create some of this role clarity? provide decision-making support tools. Sometimes if you have, guiding questions for different decisions, that can help board members, think about their roles and bring those perspectives to the table. The other piece that came out, and it came out here and also in the learning section, was the openness to feedback and evaluation and performance feedback in order to better contribute and better fulfill this role, whatever that role might be. But there was this real openness by public members to receive feedback on their performance. And that surprised me a little bit because as someone who's tried to implement some performance type review processes, I often get a lot of resistance. And there was, amongst this group, there was real openness. Diversity and inclusion was another big area. I think that, you will, as governors, as, experienced people in governance, the governance world has been thinking about diversity for a long time. There's a great Harvard Business Review article that was entitled in 2022, that was entitled, "Is Your Board Inclusive or Just Diverse?" And I think that theme came across that I think we've been doing better in terms of diversity, but we haven't really thought about the inclusion side of things yet. And so some of the people from diverse backgrounds, providing feedback that perhaps there's more to do so that I, feel truly invited to share my perspective and make a meaningful contribution. There was some, although I think a lot of work has been done in terms of diversity, especially in British Columbia, government has done a lot of work to try to increase the diversity on boards. The response rate there showed that we still have lots of work to do. So when you look at some of the specific numbers, 71% of the respondents were between 45 and 74 years old. And I think that reflects some of even the research that your organization has done in terms of how do we create the space for younger voices, younger public members to be able to contribute. Some of the data, 13% of respondents said that, identified as being from a racialized background, 2% from being from an LGBTQ background, 0% in terms of new to Canada, which in the healthcare context is actually a pretty significant issue because one of the biggest issues we're dealing with is internationally educated practitioners and how to, so not having that type of public perspective, I think is a bit worrisome. And about 60% of people said that they weren't from any of the enumerated areas of diversity. So we still have work to do. And I think we're seeing that. So again, key considerations, we have, continuing to ensure that the public members reflect the diversity of the publics that we serve. Clarifying the role of regulated professionals as public members. So Diane spoke to this. One of the diversity pieces that shocked us a little bit was that 50% of the respondents were from other regulated professions. Some of the experts that, Jocelyn will speak to this, kind of highlighted that, saying this potentially is a concern that does an accountant who's someone who's a regulated professional, do they actually truly bring the perspective of a public member? Some would say that professional background gives them a bit of an ability to understand what it means to be a regulated professional, and maybe that's really valuable in the boardroom. Others suggest that maybe that kind of taints that pure public member perspective that they bring to the table. So it was an interesting, almost like a philosophical debate that started to emerge in the research. We asked in the focus groups, what are some of the things that could help make a more inclusive space? One of the things that really came up was the importance of the chairship role. You know, the importance of the chair in kind of creating an environment where people feel invited to be brave, to, you know, bring these diverse perspectives to the table. And again, I think figuring out as a collective, actually paying attention to how do we really invite the diverse perspective? How do we pay more attention to creating inclusive spaces and not just the diversity? So that was some of the things that we found on that front. One of the quotes, creating inclusive space for all is about the power of relationships. If I'm going to be a public member, sticking my leg out or asking the potentially stupid question or saying the unpopular thing, then knowing that I have some personal relationships in the room and people trust me is important. So that was the other theme, the power of chairship, but also the power of personal relationships. People feel they can be more brave if they know that there's people that have their back. And so that was the other interesting nugget that came out. In terms of learning, again, we asked a lot of specific questions about learning. And so some of the responses, you know, yes, there's different learning opportunities. People generally feel satisfied with a lot of the ongoing learning that they're exposed to, but there's still some specific learning they want to see more of. There's no pre-appointment learning. And a lot of people talked about, if I wish I would have known what I was signing up for. And that would have, you know, really helped me. So the idea of, is there any learning we can offer to people who aren't appointed yet in that initial stage? There were some government offers some really good learning opportunities for public members. More than 50% of the people didn't know they even existed. So kind of typical that government does all this work and then doesn't do a great job of marketing the great work that they've done. And so that was put out there. Preference for learning offered at various frequencies in different forms and support. So real diversity. People want to be able to go on to a call like this. They want to be able to go to a day-long in-person course. They want to be able to do their own paced learning with online education. So really being provided with a variety of learning options was really important to people, including both technical and non-technical. So going back to, you know, that where we talked about the attributes that were seen as most important. This came out in the learning piece too. So people want to learn more about financial oversight. They want to learn more about risk oversight. They want to learn more about professional regulation. They also want to learn how to be, you know, ask better questions. They actually want to learn how to navigate conflict. They want to learn how to, you know, create inclusive space. And so there's kind of this combination of technical and more like practice-based type, you know, learning how to be better people, learning how to be better leaders, and providing people with those types of educational opportunities as well. The other big piece that came out was the value of something like this. We want more opportunities to connect with others who are doing this work. More fellow board members who with different experience, but we want this kind of community of practice idea, that we want more opportunities for networking with other board members. So a few considerations. I think that every board member is different. And so how can we create tailored learning opportunities rather than just kind of here's the 5 learning opportunities that everyone has to do? So, you know, kind of assessing someone's background and tailoring orientation and learning for their backgrounds. This isn't just for public members. We suspect this would be exactly the same. So all this learning should be provided to the professional members on the board as well. Providing profession-specific training. So it came out that we need to know more about the profession itself, of course. Providing this peer learning and mentorship, more support for these communities of practice, and allocating more resources to learning. So not just assuming that people have what they need, but actually just like we do with staff, ensuring that there's actually a budget in place for really focused learning and professional development for people in these roles. So I'm going to hand things over to Jocelyn now, who was one of the members of the expert panel with Catherine, but was also, again, kind of brings the public member perspective to this project, which was really valuable. So Jocelyn, I'll maybe hand things over to you to talk about this expert panel that we used.
Thank you, Bradley. It's such an honor to be here. I am a public board member, and I'm currently on the College of Complementary Health Professionals of British Columbia. And I have had the good fortune to be part of several health regulatory boards over the years, and it's been a tremendous experience. And I do want to clarify, I am not part of any regulated profession myself. So for me, it is an absolutely fascinating journey to learn about this world of regulation in the public interest. So I will go ahead then and introduce the expert panel who provided their insights into this report. Many of you may be familiar with these names, but I'll just go through their bios nonetheless. Harry Caton, as some of you may be familiar with, he is an internationally recognized advisor on professional regulation and governance. He developed the principles of right touch regulation, which have been adopted by professional regulators around the world. And specific to BC, he wrote the Caton Report that was released in 2019 and has given rise to the Health Professions and Occupations Act here in British Columbia. The next expert, who you are all very familiar with, Catherine Dower, and it was a pleasure to meet her virtually today. She is a health policy consultant from California and was instrumental in the work of the Pew Commission in the US and has been very involved in public members on boards, as well as she is the chair, of course, of the Public Member Network for I.C.E. Nick Lord is the Australian Health Practitioner Regulatory Agency. He's with that agency and works as the National Director of Engagement and Government Relations. Alessandra Peck is also with the Australian Health Practitioner Regulatory Agency, and she is the National Director for Regulatory Governance, Strategy, and Policy. Dennis Murphy is the Chief Administrative Officer of the Association for Dental Education in Europe and a PhD student with research focusing on board governance. Of course, I was fortunate to be a part of this group myself. And then finally, Liz Watson, who has had extensive work in the governance field, certainly here in British Columbia. She is a lawyer and is also the founder of Watson Board Advisors and has counseled thousands of directors, chairs, and CEOs on a range of governance issues. Next slide, please. So the expert comments were very, I think, very timely. You know, we are in a societal context of regulation where there is a lot of change going on, and there was a strong recognition by the experts of this shifting context that regulators are working within. For example, the profound impact of social media, Indigenous reconciliation, news coverage that is solely focused on regulation has really highlighted and amplified the public's expectations for transparency and accountability in public institutions. And that has significantly, obviously increased along with this shift. There is also a reluctance to trust public institutions. The experts also recognize that increasing numbers of public members on regulatory boards is a trend and should not be underestimated. Of course, having additional public members resulting in more acceptance of public members is a big shift. In BC, for example, traditionally health regulatory boards had up to 30% of public members. In the previously mentioned Caton report in 2019, the recommendation was for 50% of public members should be on regulatory boards. And that has created a significant shift in how these boards look and function over the past few years. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the experts reviewed and provided their thoughts around what they supported. Obviously, role clarity is absolutely key. They absolutely supported the need for role clarity to define what a public member actually is, and if other professions should be included or not as public members. As Bradley mentioned earlier, should there be lawyers or accountants as public board members on these boards? And the need to be clear of the purpose of having public members. Is it just a matter of ticking a box, or is it more than that? Is there more definition around that and that meaning, and who these individuals appointed to these boards would be? Of course, another area identified was diversity and inclusion. The need to increase diversity on boards was absolutely highlighted. Board culture relates to that, of course, and it's critical to create that inclusive space for diverse perspectives to make those really critical contributions. In the focus groups, we spoke to some public members who experienced a lack of mentorship or ongoing support when they first started a regulatory board. Was really impactful for them, and they felt that they had, obviously, that was a gap. They felt more time was needed to get up to speed, to learn not only the board and organizational culture, but also understanding the history of regulation itself, and also specific to the profession that they were regulating. Obviously, learning absolutely critical for public board members. It was emphasized by the fact that it's one of the reasons why people volunteer for these roles in the first place. Of course, along with that comes peer-to-peer support. Communities of practice were certainly, that concept was certainly supported. Public member cohorts were also supported as ways to continue this learning. Having a variety of learning options was highlighted, as Bradley had talked about earlier, having the options of online or virtual sessions, in-person learning, of course, which would also help create networking opportunities, and on-demand webinars. All these various options allows public members to have that ongoing support in a way that works for their lives and also for their preferred learning style, even if they are perhaps neurodiverse or require special accommodations. Pre-appointment learning, again, was something that was really critical, that was highlighted by the experts, where perhaps government would provide mandatory training to potential board candidates before their appointments. And training could be optional for these public members. I certainly have had the opportunity to participate in governing in the public interest, which has been an ongoing series of online modules that the BC government does provide, but these are optional, not mandatory, but it's been very helpful for me. And again, strong orientation as mentioned previously. And then of course, balance profession-specific learning with the need to stay objective. So in other words, there was a need to ensure that public members don't become so knowledgeable about the profession that they lose their public interest perspective. And something that could be an option to consider here in future is perhaps having a cooling off period where you shift public members to other board appointments that are unrelated to the professional regulation sphere, and help improve their unlearning, so to speak, so that if they do come back to these regulatory boards, that they have a fresh perspective. And I had also mentioned, of course, the community of practice opportunities for shared learning and best practices. Thank you. Next slide. So the experts also, some areas of caution, as Bradley alluded to as well, the nature of this study is small, and perhaps it does need to be taken with a grain of salt, and it would be also wonderful to see the study perhaps be encompass a larger group at some point, and that it is only BC specific at this time. Also, a caution of getting up to speed by public members was another area. The experts questioned, was it realistic to only have 3 to 6 months to get up to speed? How accurate is that? In the focus groups, we heard there was that it really took up to 3 years to be fully up to speed. So clearly the learning is ongoing, and a continuum of understanding about what that means to be on these regulatory boards is needed. Again, diversity of appointments, and certainly, especially with those who are disadvantaged in the healthcare system when it comes to health regulation, including those voices as well. Defining, of course, and clarifying the public member role was another common theme. And then a caution of asking for too much governance experience. And this was actually especially true with younger age groups who may not have much of any governance experience, and how to incorporate that generational gap and that demographic into these regulatory bodies. And then, of course, purpose and role clarity. Don't forget the registrant members are also board members, and they too require learning opportunities as well. And also how to make decisions in the public interest. There was also finally a brief, an important philosophical divide. Should regulated professionals sit as public members on other regulatory boards? So there was that sort of debate. And so there was a caution of including other professionals on regulatory boards. And then finally, the memorable quote, being a member of a regulatory board requires members to normally serve two key but very diverse functions: governance of the organization and regulation of the professions. And then growing and maintaining this expertise takes investment, ongoing development, and perhaps even a little luck. And Bradley, perhaps I'll hand it back to you for a moment.
Sure. Just to close things off, as a bit of a summary, we thought we would, from our own unique perspectives, just kind of talk about some of the nuggets that really rose to the surface a year after. You know, what are the things that we're still thinking about from our each unique perspective? So Jocelyn, maybe we'll start with you with the public members' perspective.
Sure, thanks. So the things that I really noted, and I was really pleased to be a part of and listen in on the focus group discussions, but there was a real note of regardless of what regulatory body we were a part of, regardless of the profession, there was so much shared experience and shared, I guess, understanding, and that there was so much overlap. I think when you're often on these regulatory boards, it's very easy to feel that that this is the only organization that's experiencing whatever we're going through. So so it leads into the second point, which is, so perhaps there's a lot of opportunity here for cross-pollination and shared learning, and ensuring that we are all actually benefiting from each other's experiences, because they are quite likely very similar, if not the same. And then, of course, the need for more role clarity, and something that I think, and I've certainly been thinking about as well, is instead of thinking about the public members as representing the public, they are only bringing their own unique experience and perspective and their lived experience, and that it is not about representing the public as an entire, millions of people, but perhaps more as an individual coming to the table with your own thoughts and experiences. So that was an important distinguishing point there. And then, of course, a governance experience, while it is valuable, no question, and as the experts noted as well, there's certainly a need to ensure that there is that nuance of regulatory governance. A lot of individuals do have nonprofit governance experience, but the regulatory governance piece has a nuance to it. There's considerably more legislation involved, considerably more discussion, and even the simple fact that perhaps it's not even, they don't have shareholders per se, but they have the general public to consider, which is a very different perspective. And then, of course, the value of non-professional public members, individuals who are not part of any professional regulatory body at all, that they are simply coming in as the general public and with their own lived experience. So I'll hand that back to you, Bradley.
Thank you. Diane, how about you from a CEO's perspective?
Yeah, thanks. And I'm sensitive to the time. I know we want time for questions, so I'll go quickly. So the first thing that strikes me is that these findings and recommendations are not unique to public members. I think that certainly in terms of role clarity and learning, They are as applicable to what we consider to be our registrant or our licensee members on the health boards in particular, as they are to the public members. So, you know, need for clarity about you're not there to represent the profession, you're there to bring a public perspective, and also lots of learning opportunities that would be important to just become better governors. The second is, I think, you know, we talk a lot about diversity in our context, but we're not always clear, I don't think, about what that actually means for us. And I think that we have an opportunity to be clear about not only what we mean by diversity, but how it makes us better regulators. So not just talking about diversity for the sake of talking about it, but actually ensuring that there's a link between that conversation and how it just makes us better at what we do in terms of regulation. The power of the chair to create inclusive space. I watched a talk by a chair in the US, and I can see her, I just can't remember her name. And she was known as a champion for creating inclusive spaces. And one of the analogies she made was being at the best dinner party. When you go to a great dinner party, you actually, you know, have great food, great conversation, great company. You leave feeling like you were really part of a wonderful event. And I really liked that. I thought that to me sort of resonated as, you know, wouldn't that be wonderful to leave a board meeting and feel like that? Also, the importance of sharing this type of work. We know that this work is not perfect, but, you know, continuing the conversations around this, trying to broaden our study would be awesome. And the last thing is, as staff, how do we help support good decision making? So what are the decision making principles that we can help support? How do we develop briefing notes that provide enough information but not too much? We heard from public members that they don't need a thesis on, you know, a particular issue in terms of background. They need a summary, and they also need to be reminded of maybe past decisions that they were even part of that would influence, you know, decisions going forward. So I have been thinking about that. What's our role as staff to really help all members of our boards make good decisions? So Bradley, that's it for me.
Okay, and from my perspective, I think I've really touched on all of these pieces from a learning perspective, you know, helping provide better learning, more diverse learning options, learning focused not only on kind of the technical stuff, but also those practices, creating opportunities for people to, you know, become better leaders through the learning. More customized learning, so, you know, tailoring learning to people's individual experiences. More opportunities for communities of practice for board members to come together, and more and better feedback. So more, if we're going to do evaluations, making sure that they're done well, but providing people who are really leaning into these opportunities the opportunity to get better feedback about how they're doing. So that's really, I think, in terms of what's next, we're hoping to, you know, we like sharing this. It's been a year now of sharing this, but we also want, I think there's an opportunity to do this on a bigger platform. And so I think that's really important too. So maybe I'll end the share and just kind of turn it over. We have about 10 minutes for questions.
Let me say thank you to all of you for this presentation. It has been terrific and has sparked a number of questions. I've got my list of questions, but I want to offer it up to the group to raise their hands or ask questions. I'm sure people have some thoughts and comments. Every time I see or look at this report, I see something new. So I'm very intrigued. And although you are all very humble, and it is a modest report, it is also a landmark report. I'm going to go on record in saying that because it just hasn't been done before, and it will certainly serve as a milestone for others to hopefully refer to, as well as to possibly replicate. I would love to see it replicated and spread to other provinces, as well as other countries and other fields. So thank you. Any questions from the attendees today? I had one quick question, I hope, and I'm wondering if any of you can comment on the connections that you see between the regulatory boards and certifying bodies. And so, because I.C.E., of course, is in the private sector certification, can either of the speakers today comment on that connection that you see? Can you infer from your report anything?
So Catherine, when you talk about you're talking about like credentialing agencies in particular. Yeah.
Yes.
It didn't come up in the study, but certainly in many of the health professions, there is a nexus between credentialing agencies and the regulators. I think there really is a linkage between in our context, credentialing is around internationally educated and particular in terms of making sure that we do a good job of that we're actually encouraging the right people to actually move forward in the process, to be registered, et cetera. So there's a lot of effort being placed on that work, a lot of pressure as well, political pressure in terms of getting more people in more quickly, and that tension between how do you do that, but still making sure that you're actually, ensuring the right outcome for those that are applying.
Exactly. Thank you. Tom, I see your hand up.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
So very, very interesting work and a great presentation. I wish we had more time. I had two questions, and maybe there's not enough time to address both of them. One has to do with whether there are any, whether the issue ever came up of other forms of public deliberation in order to get input to the board beyond just the person sitting there representing the public, which would be, I feel, very helpful and supportive to the public, the one public member, but also for the whole board. I like Diane's notion that everybody needs to be educated. All the members of the board need to be educated around the same issues. The other question has to do with learning across professions, and that idea of a community of practice among public members really intrigues me. We've been trying to work on this in medicine in the US, not very successfully, but curious to know if that is being done in Canada. Creating.
I can take a run. First of all, in the community of practice, it's not really happening, but we think that it needs to. So this is kind of when it started to bubble up. We've had conversations with government and with some of the more like the associations of regulators to say, someone should pick this up and own this. No one has yet. Your first question just about, can you remind me of the first question?
In terms of public deliberation or public input.
Right.
Yeah.
It did come up, and I think it's tied to what Jocelyn talked about, not feeling the weight of representing the entire population. Well, one way of not feeling that weight is if there's other avenues that the board is getting good public input. So whether it's, these, public advisory panels or, just good consultation, it did come up as a way of don't just rely on us, and especially from some of the diverse members, one of the Indigenous members saying, there's 250 First Nations communities in British Columbia alone. Don't look to me to be the sole voice of every, First Nations person in this province. So I think ensuring that, just like you said, even though we have 50-50, that we're not using that as an excuse not to consult better with the public.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Sylvia Powers?
Yes, and I'll be brief. I apologize for being nasally. I got some kind of virus going on. So glad I'm on Zoom. But in reference to diversity and inclusion, are there any benchmarks, and how do you recommend in reaching diverse communities, especially because of health disparities, and making sure they are represented with a public member?
Yeah, I think we've been engaging in conversations with the government, because government appoints the public members to these. And one of the things that government has been doing better recently is partnering with other community agencies that have access to communities that might not normally just apply to a government website to be on a board. And so partnering with community organizations, whether it's an LGBTQ advocacy group or an organization advocating for a professionally trained internationally trained engineers, or but there's lots of community organizations. So I think that's what they have really felt has been a major step forward, is partnerships rather than just kind of this passive way of trying to recruit people to be on the boards.
Thank you.
That's a whole other, yeah, we could spend another hour on that question alone. Thank you. I know we're at the top of the hour. We probably should wrap up. I want to express my thanks to Jocelyn, Bradley, and Diane, and the team behind this report and today's presentation. Thank you all to the attendees today. Thank you to I.C.E. for hosting this. Thank you, of course, to Becky and the Public Member Committee for sponsoring it. I just really have a lot of gratitude today for all the work that's been done. I hope this is just the start of more conversations. With that, I'll turn it back to Becky and or Katie to sign us off.
Becky, do you have any closing comments?
Yeah, I also want to extend my thanks. It's been a fascinating presentation. I really appreciate it. And I want to say that even though you say that it's a small study, on the basis of my own personal experience over decades of working with public members on regulatory boards and certifying boards and interviewing a number of them, and what you've found is very consistent with all of my own personal experience. So I think it's going to be very meaningful because it's far more systematic than and structured than any other study or report of which I'm aware. So thank you very much for doing this.
Thanks for having us. It's
Thank
been
you.
a pleasure. Thank
Thank
you.
you all so much. Have a good rest
Bye.
of your day.
Bye.
Thank you.